I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the cycle of generational trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, the consequences of parental burnout. I have a phenomenal, essential, a must-listen episode for you on understanding parental burnout, its consequences for the parent, their partner, and specifically children. Also, what could be done to prevent it? And importantly, when you find yourself in either mild, moderate, or severe burnout, what steps can you take to mitigate it? We have covered this topic on the show before with guest Kate Golick in episode Parental Burnout, Causes, Signs, and How to Cope with It. But today's episode will add new layers to help you understand the subject better and offer you practical guidance on dealing with parental burnout. I really enjoyed talking to Moïra Mikolajczak, who is a professor of medical and health psychology at the University of Louvain, Belgium, Université Catholique de Louvain. I hope I pronounced it well. I really wanted to try saying the name of the university, and I hope we have listeners from Belgium. Anyways, after 15 years of research on emotional intelligence, she reoriented her research in 2015 on parental burnout, an underinvestigated topic at the time. Together with her colleague Isabelle Roscom and their team, she has now published numerous scientific papers and 4 books on parental burnout. They co-head the International Investigation of Parental Burnout Consortium, the Parental Burnout Research Lab, and the Training Institute for Psychology and Health. Moïra received her PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain in 2006, and she did her postdoc with James Gross at Stanford University. I learned so much from this episode, and I really hope you will find it helpful. Please enjoy. So, are you still studying burnout, parental burnout?
Oh, yes, definitely. More than ever.
More than ever. So this is your passion, this is your life's work.
Well, I have worked for 15 years on emotional competencies, so something totally different. And it's only in 2015 that we've started research on parental burnout. And it was really a small side project, very teeny project with a research intern. And the results were so interesting that we really got fascinated and wanted to go deeper into the subject. And then the results were each time more interesting. And there were a lot of interest for the subject from the media. So quite quickly, there were many journalist interviews, etc. So we were completely overwhelmed by the interest for the topic. And at the beginning, we didn't have actually any answer to the question that journalists were asking us. And so these questions prompted new research. And actually, that's how we have gone on since the beginning. It's our own questions, but also questions from journalists, from parents, etc., that have fueled the research.
And especially now after the pandemic, right? It's a very hot topic.
Yeah, the pandemic really contributed to lift the veil on the subject, to remove also part of the taboo, because it was really a taboo subject. And I think that was one of maybe the only thing that was good in this pandemic is that it made a lot of people understand what a burnout parent could go through. Because beforehand, we felt a lot of judgment towards parents in burnout. When there were media coverage, there are often people have the possibility to comment, like to post comments under the article or under the video, etc. And yeah, the comments were really judgmental, like, why would you have 4 children if you cannot manage them? Or if you're so exhausted, just, I don't have the term in English, but gather yourself together and just get on. Like, no one could understand these poor parents. And after the pandemic, for sure, the level of understanding has increased a lot.
Yeah, you're right. So taboo. You're right. I don't think I've even thought about parental burnout as a thing while being a parent. But once I learned about it, I recognized that, wow, I have experienced parental burnout at certain stages of my life, but I had no idea what it was. Talking about it, giving a name, sharing stories, sharing interviews like this, educating people, raising awareness is so important. Because if a parent is experiencing severe burnout or even moderate, knowing that what they're experiencing is normal, is something that has a name, it already destigmatizes it and makes you even already feel better a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree with you.
And how is parental burnout different from job burnout?
So the main difference is that the context. So parental burnout is a syndrome, an exhaustion syndrome that originates and manifests itself mainly in the parenting role. And job burnout is an exhaustion syndrome that originates and mainly manifests itself in the work sphere. So burnout is a contextual syndrome by opposition to depression. For instance, depression is a syndrome that is transversal to several areas of life. When you are depressed, you have no desire to go at work, to take care of your children, to go and see your friends, to do sport or whatsoever. Why? So it's really transversal. While burnout is contextual, you may be burned out in your parenting role while still being very happy to go to work, because this is a place where you have the feeling that you can breathe and somehow relax. That's what some people say. And by opposition, when you are in burnout from your job, you may be very happy to be put on sick leave and enjoy life with your children. So yeah, that's the main difference between the two.
Oh, I see. And yeah, you spoke about depression and burnout. I find that quite interesting because the symptoms of the two could be confused, right? But the fact that it's contextual, it totally makes sense. You can be burned out in your role as a parent, but in other areas of your life, you may not feel that way.
Exactly. So that's clearly one of the main distinctions between burnout and depression. Another distinction is that burnout is an exhaustion syndrome that comes from too much stress. So the origin, the cause of burnout is always too much stress, whereas the causes of depression are very diverse. It may be too much stress, but it also may be a loss. It may be a failure in a project that was very dear to your heart or whatever. I mean, and you can be depressed in your parenting role while not burn out. Imagine that you have a child who is homosexual, let's take that example, and you don't accept that at all. And so you are in a deep suffering as a parent, and you may even be depressed because of that. And you wouldn't necessarily be in burnout because so not all parenting suffering are burnout. There are many forms of parenting suffering.
Oh man, I know, right? Parenting is hard. And especially in the developed countries in the Western world, and you have a paper on it, right? In fact, I wrote down in my notes. Let me see. It was compelling. I didn't read the paper, but it said 3 reasons why it's prevalent in individualistic countries. And it totally makes sense without even having read the paper. I can say, yes, that's true. Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, there are, of course, more than three reasons for which parental burnout may be more prevalent in Western countries, but reasons are only being studied as we speak. So, what we know is that in Western countries, people have much less social support, as in collectivistic countries. So, we exert our parenting role much more alone than in other countries. So, that's one reason why we are more exposed to parental burnout. Also, in individualistic Western countries are individualistic countries, and in individualistic countries, the desires, the needs of the person come before the needs of the group. And so for us, being a parent requires a sacrifice. Somehow we have to put another person's needs before our own. And this is costly. Another reason is that because individual needs and desires are so important, we also raise children who are used to pay attention to their own desires and needs. And so they have a voice, they can express their desires. So, for instance, you will tell your children, well, today we will eat, let's say, steak and mashed potatoes. And they will tell you, no, I want to eat pasta with bolognese. And you will say, no, because, and you will start to explain why it's so much important to eat this and not that. A Chinese or an African parent will never have to argue about the choice of the evening food, because that's another problem, is that our children's desire are expressed all the time and we have to negotiate with them. So there are many other reasons. Another reason is that in Western countries, the concept of positive parenting has become increasingly prevalent. And so parents feel a lot of pressure on their shoulders. They don't know how to punish, if they can still punish. And so they don't know how to shape their children's behavior. In other parts of the world, this question is non-existing. I mean, you don't ask yourself, how will I punish? Is this punishment appropriate to the personality of my child? Can I do that? So we spend a lot of energy because of things that are very typical of our culture. So that's some of the reasons why Western parents are more exposed to burnout.
I see. And you also have another paper about 42 countries, including Iran, Turkey, and more traditional countries. Can you share some findings from your research from that study, the 42 countries study? I found that, wow, this is interesting that you're going so globally.
Yeah, the motivation for this study was first to see if there was a difference in the prevalence of parental burnout across the world, because there were two competing hypotheses. The first would be the prevalence of parental burnout is exactly the same across countries, but the reasons to burn out are different. So let's say the number of parents who burn out in the US is exactly the same as in Togo, in Africa. But in the US, parents will burn out because they are driving their kids to extracurricular activities, they are cooking organic foods or whatever. And in Togo, parents would burn out because they have many children, they are working with a child on their back, and so this was the first hypothesis. The prevalence would be the same, but the reasons to burn out would be different. And the other competing hypothesis was that there would be a difference in the very prevalence of parental burnout, whereby in some countries, the prevalence would be much lower than in others, possibly because of the reasons that we've evoked, lack of or lower social support in some countries, higher pressure on parents' shoulders, etc., etc. And this is exactly what we found. There was a huge difference in the point prevalence of parental burnout across countries, where some countries were 5 or 6 times more exposed to parental burnout than others. And unsurprisingly, or surprisingly maybe for some people, Western countries were much more exposed, even though we have on average much less children. And that's interesting, because you may think that the higher the number of children, the higher the parenting load, and so the higher your risk to burn out. And it was not the case. And so factors like lack of social support, pressure, and blah, blah, blah were more explanatory than the number of children.
What was the country with the lowest rates of parental burnout?
I don't remember. I should go back to the results. It's most certainly in African countries. And then we had Asian countries with a slightly higher prevalence. And the highest prevalence was for Western countries like the US, Belgium, Poland, and others.
I see. Yeah, it's really interesting. So it doesn't matter how many children you have, basically. It's those other stress factors that contribute.
Yeah, and also...
And the social support.
No, also, I mean, I think that even if we would compare the two families, an African family and a US family with the same number of children, we would see difference because in Africa it's perfectly, and in Asia, but they don't have as many children. That's why I take the comparison with an African country. It's totally normal that elder children take care of the younger children. They don't question that. Whereas in our culture, we don't want one child to bear a kind of parenting load, and so we want each and every of our child receive the same level of attention and blah. And so you see, so we don't benefit from what the older children could bring to the younger ones.
Yeah, and we're doing it alone. We're forming individual relationships with each child. The children are not helping. We don't have the social support. It's all too much, really. It's all too much. What mitigates parental burnout? Factors. You wrote about emotional competence, right? Lowering the demands, increasing resources. I would really love to get into the mitigating factors.
Mm-hmm. So there are several. Fortunately, there is not only one, because this would be very depressing, because if you wouldn't have it, you would be condemned to parental burnout. So there are several factors. Some are external to the parent and others are internal. So one very important mitigating factor is the support that you can receive from your partner. Not only the very concrete,
financial, practical
support, but also the emotional support. And so sometimes the partner cannot help practically because he or she is ill or often absent, etc. But he or she is present emotionally, and that's important too. So the two forms of support are important. Another mitigating factor is the support that you can have from your broader network, like your friends. If you have friends with whom you can share your difficulties, with whom you can laugh about it, can provide you practical or emotional support, who can distract you, that's very important. Some parents are very isolated. They don't dare to share. They feel compelled to share only the positive. And some are in a kind of prison whereby, because they are so inclined to give a positive image of themselves as parents, they don't dare then to share their difficulties. And so whenever a difficulty comes up, they are very alone with it. So yeah, that's a trap. So some practical support from the neighbors is also a protective mitigating factor. Then there are another category of mitigating factors. It's factor characteristic of the parent. If I have good emotional competence, if I have ways to manage stress, to decrease the tension, of course, I'm less vulnerable to chronic stress and thus to parental burnout. If I am less perfectionistic as a parent, if I lower my parenting standards, that's also a mitigating factor, because of course the opposite is also true. If I have very high parenting standards, if I'm very perfectionistic as a parent, that's a big risk factor. And maybe the worst combination is parents who have not had a happy childhood. They have had not so good parents, and so they want to be the parent that they would have liked to have. They want to be the parent that they would have wanted to have. And so these parents have very high parenting standards, and at the same time they don't have the manual. They don't know how to be a good parent because they haven't had good parents. And so that's very hard. And so if you are that type of parent, if you belong to this category of parent, very high parenting standards, no user manual, then it's really important to lower your parenting standards, to accept that you're just doing your best. And that there is a sentence that says, as a parent, it's impossible not to fail our children at least a little bit. I mean, this is roughly the translation.
What language is that expression? Say it in French.
Apparently, it comes from Chinese, which I don't know, but in French, it's en tant que parent, il est impossible de ne pas rater ses enfants au moins un peu. So as a parent, you will always fail your children at least a little bit. So if you do your best, because there is no parental determinism, we as parents explain only a little portion of the development of our children. And we are led to think that we have a very big role in our children's development, but that's false by every scientific evidence. We explain only a little portion of the variance. And that's actually very good news, because if this was not the case, imagine this would mean that as a parent, you could decide the future of your children. If you want your children to be a big mathematician or a very big musician, famous musician, the child would be what you would decide him or her to be. But of course, this is not how things work, because there are genetics explain a lot, actually. There are the influence of culture, of your other parent, of school, of peers. There are a lot of influences that temper and decrease our role as parent. And so being aware that, in fact, we count much little than what we believe, that may help also to decrease the pressure, especially in difficult times. So that's a mitigating factor as well, being able to remind oneself that we can do our best, but that results are unpredictable whatsoever, and that not everything is on our shoulders.
Yes, this is great news. This is so fascinating. Hey, this is Anna with a quick announcement. Authentic Parenting is a free resource, and support for this podcast come from listeners like you. Your contribution helps cover the many costs associated with the production of the podcast, hosting, producing, and especially post-production. This is an ad-free show, and donations are greatly appreciated. To make a one-time donation in any amount that you desire, or make a monthly donation, go to authenticparenting.com/support. Once again, authenticparenting.com/support. Thank you for your generous and kind support. That means the world to me. Now let's get back to the show. Thank you for that. But I want to ask you then, yes, given the fact that we have very small role, or in the pie chart of influence, we have a tiny little sliver, in what area of parenting we do need to focus on? What's the most important thing as parents that we do have an influence? Is this known? Is this studied? If you can say a few words about that, I think that would be great.
So indeed, in most domains, our influence is much lower than what we believe. One thing that we can try to, on which we have more influence, is the quality, but not full influence. Maybe slightly more influence is the quality of attachment, the quality of the security of attachment that we can provide to our child. And that's much more important than many things. And sometimes as parents, we exhaust ourselves driving our kids to extracurricular activities or doing things that we believe that are essential to their cognitive development or social development, etc. And sometimes, because of that, we have less energy to invest in the relationship, in the very relationship with our child. And this relationship is the quality, the security of this relationship is super important. So sometimes we could do less, but sometimes it's just good to just spend time with our children and not always do things, you see?
Yes, I see. There was also a study that you conducted that shows gender differences. I was really interested in that, and same-sex couples how is parental burnout manifesting in those couples?
Yeah, so this was a Portuguese researcher who conducted that research. And again, there were several conflicting hypotheses, but I should go and check the results first before I comment, because I'm pretty sure that I have them in mind, but I should double check. So in this study, there were also two conflicting hypotheses. The first would be that same-sex couples face a lot of external pressure and struggles that would increase difficulties in parenthood and thus increase parental burnout. And the other alternative hypothesis would be that actually same-sex couples face indeed several external challenges and stressors and pressure, but that they develop resources, internal resources, or get external resources to compensate. And so then we wouldn't see any difference between same-sex and different sex couples in parental burnout. And this is exactly what we observe. So in fact, same-sex families are not more exposed to parental burnout than traditional families. But in same-sex couples, the best predictor of parental burnout was the same as in heterosexual couples. That is the imbalance between stressors and resources. So whether you are a heterosexual or a homosexual couple, what will predict your risk to burnout in parenting is the imbalance between too many stressors, external or internal, and not enough resources. And so all in all, the scale is not more imbalanced in same-sex families.
How about in the heterogeneous heterosexual couple, mom versus dad? Because mom does a lot of the mental load of parenting falls on the mother still, right? At least in the Western countries, moms do a lot more. What patterns do you see there?
In heterosexual couples, yeah. And just to come back 1 second to what we were saying previously, one important resource that we find same-sex couples is a much more egalitarian way of sharing parenting tasks. And so this is a very specific resource that compensates for some challenges that are specific to those families. So coming back to what you were just saying about unegalitarian task sharing in heterosexual couples, yeah, this is true. Studies show that even in egalitarian countries, such as the US, Belgium, France, etc., we are not so egalitarian as we think, because indeed 65 to 70% of parenting and domestic tasks are still performed by women. So, and actually, a French researcher, Astrid Lebert-Charon, observed that you are more at risk of parental burnout if you have a spouse, a husband, that does not help you enough than if you are not married or are divorced. So it is better to be alone than to be with someone that does not help.
Oh, so that's like the mindset plays a role too, your perception.
Exactly.
Your expectations, rather.
Exactly. And there is also a cultural influence in this, because we, as in Western countries, we are particularly sensitive to inequities in domestic and parenting task sharing. So a woman who feels that her partner does not do enough will suffer from it more than in, for instance, African countries or Asian countries, where gender roles are more defined, and they will suffer much less from an egalitarian or inequity in task sharing.
That's fascinating, completely mind-blowing. Yeah, I really want to talk about the consequences of parental burnout for the parent, for the partner, and especially for children.
Yeah, that's indeed very important. And it is probably the most robust area of research as far as parental burnout is concerned. So, well, research shows that the consequences are pretty severe for the parent himself or herself and the children. So parental burnout strongly increases suicidal ideations. So the more severe parental burnout gets, the more frequent the suicidal ideations. And our research shows that suicidal ideations are much more prevalent in parents in burnout than in employees in burnout or in depressed people. So, and this is astonishing, given that suicidal ideation is a diagnostic criteria of depression. And so we know that they are very prevalent in depression, but they are even more prevalent in parental burnout. And there are reasons for that. One reason is that you cannot resign from your parenting role. You cannot change children. When you're burnout at work, you can change company, you can change work, you can be put on sick leave, maybe not in the US, but in countries where there is a big social security. Whereas you cannot be put on sick leave of your children. You cannot change children. So parents often feel trapped in their situation. And so that's one explanation for suicidal ideation. And another explanation is related to the consequences of parental burnout on children. Parental burnout strongly increases neglectful and violent behaviors against children. And so often parents in burnout think that their children would be better off without them. And so this further increases suicidal ideations because they feel trapped, they want a way out, and furthermore they think that their children would be better off without them. So like everything points to that specific solution. And so to make the link with the consequences of parental burnout on children, so we've seen that there is almost a linear relationship between the severity of parental burnout and the frequency of neglectful or violent behaviors. And this even in parents who were not violent before, and even in parents who are philosophically opposed to educational violence. And this is not so surprising, because you may then wonder, but then why are these parents violent if they're opposed to violence, if they've never been violent before? So there are several explanations that we are beginning to explore. One possible explanation is the increase in cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So burnout is associated with a very strong increase in cortisol. And as you may know or not, cortisol is associated with a decrease in the ability to inhibit a behavior. The higher your levels of cortisol, the lower your ability to inhibit some impulsive behavior. And so there is no surprise that if you are in burnout, your levels of cortisol are high, you are very angry, irritated by your children, and thus you may act impulsively. So this is one reason that may explain this link between burnout and violence. Another reason is related to executive functioning. So we are exploring this now, and my PhD student presented results related to that exactly this morning, showing that parental burnout decreases executive functioning. And executive functioning is a complicated term encompassing different types of cognitive functions, and among them two very important: this inhibitory capacity, so this inhibition capacity, but also the flexibility. And so when you're angry about your child, you want to punish him this way, and you need some cognitive flexibility to think about another way of another punishment or another way to react. And also you need to be able to inhibit your impulsive behavior. And our preliminary results show that parental burnout decreases both flexibility and inhibition. And we know that these two cognitive functions are essential to counter impulsive, violent behaviors. So there are very logical reasons why parents in burnout are more violent. So I'm not saying here that it is not their fault or that they are not responsible. I'm saying here that they need help. They need help because burnout, as severity increases, the risk for violence also increases.
And would you say excessive yelling also falls under the category of violent behavior?
Yeah, that's very important. By violent behaviors, I'm speaking here not only about physical, but also about verbal violence, which actually come first and which is more important in parental burnout than physical violence. So you are totally right. And it takes the form of hysterical screaming at the children. That's what a lot of parents in burnout report. They say, I become hysterical. I scream like hell. I have the feeling that I'm possessed. Sometimes it takes the form of insults,
name calling, put downs, right? All of those.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't necessarily mean hitting, spanking, physical violence. You know, this as violence as well.
Yeah, definitely. And physical violence only comes when in parents who were not violent before, physical violence is the last to appear. It only appears when stages or parental burnout are severe. Fortunately, it's not the first form to appear. But in parents who are already physically violent, already use spanking, hitting, etc., it will increase the frequency.
Oh, man. Yeah, I saw a study about hair cortisol concentration as a biomarker of parental burnout, and I found that quite interesting. So, what are ways that a parent can identify that they're in burnout? What are the signs of burnout? I mean, we already mentioned so many, right? But if you were to put into a bullet point so that at this point the listener will, listen to all of this, have a sort of summary of the signs, what would those be?
So the alert signs would be, I would say that the 3 signs should be considered as alert signs. If you feel that you're really fatigued, if you feel like you're very irritable vis-a-vis your children, and if you feel that you are super impatient, that you lack patience, these are signs that you're under a high level of stress. It doesn't mean that you are in burnout, but these are warning signs that you should pay attention to. And these possibly, likely indicate that your balance between stressors and resources is imbalanced and that something must be done to rebalance it, either by removing some stressors or by adding resources. Because if the scale keeps being imbalanced, at some point it will just be too much. And then comes the exhaustion. You don't have energy at all. And your reservoir, or I don't know how to say, is empty.
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. And the escape ideations, right? To leave the children, and not necessarily suicidal ideation, correct? But just the idea of my children will be better off without me. I want to go away for a few days or for a month, or those escape ideations or an escape. So I want to ask you then, what other forms of escape activities parent can engage in? Like social media or detaching themselves. So can you speak about that?
Yeah, as you said, social media, computer work. Many parents in burnout confess that they stay later at work and go and get their children at school or at daycare as later as possible. So basically reducing the time of contact spent with the children. Some escape via substance use, alcohol, other type of drugs. So forms of escape are numerous, well, very diverse, and some of themselves make the bed of other problems. Like if you take alcohol to cognitively, emotionally escape, distract yourself, then you become at risk of alcohol dependence. And we know from the job burnout literature that burnout strongly increase the risk of alcohol dependence. So, and this is most likely true as well for parental burnout, because there is already a study documenting that parental burnout is associated with an increase in alcohol consumption. So, and maybe if you spend more time at work to spend less time at home, maybe you increase your risk for job burnout. Because now you expect a lot from your work. You expect that your work will bring you happiness. And so you may be more and more sensitive to frustration at work. So escaping, you escape your parenting stress and suffering, but you create other problems doing so.
Yeah, so then this brings me to the last question, I think, which is the most important one. What can we do about preventing parental burnout? I think prevention would be ideal. And if we can't prevent, we are in burnout. There is different forms of burnout, right? There is moderate to severe burnout. What would be the first things that someone in severe or moderate burnout can do? I want to talk about those factors.
Yeah, so I will first address your first question. And I like that you talk about prevention first, because indeed we must do everything we can to prevent parental burnout. And prevention must not only be thought of at individual level, but also at a collective level. And so I think that it is of utmost importance that we really think collectively, how can we prevent this? And there are many perspectives. I will name 3 of them, but there are tons of them. First is institutional ways to prevent burnout. Alors, in the US, I am not sure that you have parenting leave when a child is born, but in many countries, there are maternal leave. But because the leave is only devoted to women or only taken by women, this installs gender roles that will persist across parenting, whereby the mother will take more on her shoulders. And so doing things to increase equality in parenting task sharing is an important area to prevent parental burnout. Another important area is to increase also flexibility at work, because allow people to better conciliate their parenting and professional lives. Another way that involves all of us is social network. Many of us post on social network only the best of our parenting. Many of us post advice, but doing so, we put pressure on other people's shoulders. And so basically, before posting anything on parenting, we should ask ourselves the question, by doing so, will I decrease pressure on other parents, or will I increase it? If it's likely that we will increase the pressure on parents or on some categories of parents, we should probably refrain. So, and this is all have a part to play in preventing parental burnout. Collectively, we could also be less judgmental of others and be more helpful. If we see that someone is in difficulty, instead of judging that person, we could offer help in a way that is not condescending, etc., that doesn't make her or him feel bad. We could share more about our difficulties in parenting or challenges, and not always try to put the best, face and appear as the perfect mothers. Because, many people who consult us say, I wanted so much, I wanted to preserve my image as perfect mother. But this image is harmful for yourself, but also for others. So there is a collective effort that we must all do in preventing parental burnout. Then there is also some things that we can do individually, is monitoring our scale. How many stressors do we have? How many resources? And in times where we have less resources, decrease our demands or decrease our stressors. And in times where we have more stressors, try to seek for new resources. So this is also super important. So that would be my main leads for prevention. Now, you also ask, when we are in burnout, what should we do? And as you said, it's not the same when it's severe burnout or light or moderate. And you are perfectly right, because when we are in severe burnout, we don't have any energy anymore. We don't have cognitive energy. We are not able to think properly. So we don't know what is in our scale anymore. We will see the biggest stressor, like the difficult child, or we will see the most important missing resource, partner that doesn't help enough, or grandparents that do not help enough. But basically, we don't have an overview. We don't see clearly. And we are not in a position where we are able to see the changes that are needed, nor in the position to change the things that would need change. And so for people who are in severe burnout, I think that there is no other way except consulting a professional person whose job is to see clearly your situation, what are the changes that are realistic, what changes are not realistic, and who will see the less costly changes that will have maximum effects, basically, because that's the way out for parent in burnout, bringing very small changes that will have a big impact. For people who are in lighter or moderate burnout, they could start by themselves to try to draw their scale and try to put all the stressors that they face. And you can do a table with as many rows as days of the week. And then for each day, what constitutes stress in your parenting? And you will see that there are stressors that look minor, like, let's say, homework or running errands or cooking or whatever, that become stressful by their repetition, or because they come on top of other things, or because they involve things you're not good at. For me, cooking is a stressor. Maybe for you, it's a relaxing moment.
No. I am with you. For me too.
And for some people, doing the math homework with the child is a pleasure. And for others, it's a nightmare, really. And that's important, is to really identify what are these little stressors that in fact have a big impact and could be tackled maybe by introverting the roles with your partner and, or lighten in some ways, or resources that you don't have right now, but yet that you could think of maybe adding. So yeah, that would be the way out.
Wow, this is incredible. Yeah, I really, my brain is on fire. I am absorbing all of this. I love what you're sharing. This is so fascinating. I can see why you keep studying and studying this for years. So how has this research informed how you live and parent?
Like you, I have realized afterwards that I have gone through parental burnout, but I didn't know that it existed, so I didn't put that name on at the time. So now I think that it has impacted me in several ways. One way is that clearly I have dropped from social networks because it put pressure on me. So I have just closed my accounts first. I have reduced my standards. It doesn't mean that I don't want the best for my daughter. I do want the very best for her. But I have come to realize that I can only give the best of myself, and that the best that I can give is not the same every day. Some days I'm just exhausted or feeling bad because for other reasons. And I accept that these days I can give less than the days where I'm perfect shape. So yes, being more accepting of who I am is certainly a lesson I have taken from this research. Yes, and trying, also identifying some things that were really stressful for me as a parent, not necessarily stressful for my friends, and accepted that for this, okay, I will be not such a good mother. I cannot cook very well. Okay, I have to accept that. But I have other qualities that my friends do not have. And so I have accepted that we are all different, and that parenting is also done. I'm not alone. So the other parent is also doing his share. And so, yes, basically.
These are great. So one last question, it just popped into my mind. If a parent is in burnout, how long can that last? Can that last weeks, months? Like, are they duration markers?
Yeah, so scientifically, we do not have an answer to that question, and probably because there is a huge variety in the durations. So we hear parents who have been in burnout for weeks, but we have a clinical consultation center in the university. And some parents report having in burnout for 2 years, sometimes more. So now that the pandemic has lifted the veil on parental burnout, parents come and consult earlier than at the very beginning. At the very beginning, people came and said, well, I've been in burnout for 2 years, 3 years. They were completely run down. It was terrible. And it took really like a year to get them back on their feet. And today I have the feeling that people come slightly earlier, maybe because they put this name earlier, and so they can seek help also earlier.
This is fascinating, and I so appreciate that you were able to join me today, and I learned so much. I wish you good luck in your research, and I am going to keep in touch with you to learn more. So thank you so much. How do you pronounce your name and your last name correctly?
My first name is Moïra and my last name is Mikolajczak, like the surname, like the first name Mikolajczak, but it's Mikolajczak. So it's quite easy to pronounce.
Yes. Moïra Mikolajczak.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I think this is going to be one of my favorite episodes.
Thank you so much.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What did you learn? What are some takeaways from this fantastic episode about parental burnout? Have you ever found yourself in one? I would love to hear from you. As always, you can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, we have a free tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. Support the podcast and show your love. The first thing you can do is rate and or write a review for the show on Apple Podcast, in Spotify, or wherever else you listen to the show. The second thing you can do is make a donation, either a one-time donation in any amount that you desire or a monthly donation. Learn more and make a contribution at authenticparenting.com/support. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.